So welcome to Math 119-312, Mathematics of Pandemics. And today we're going to be hearing from the contact tracing group.
Okay. Hi, everybody. So today we're going to be looking at contact tracing, and we're going to try and work you guys through kind of a cost-benefit analysis of this and how it would potentially help moving forward if we are able to properly trace infected individuals and move forward with that. Today it'll be myself, so I'm Gabby, and two others. I think Garrett and Mila are on as well. So the first major thing is kind of how do we measure the spread of an illness or virus, and specifically how do we measure the spread of a pandemic. So one very important variable that people use is R0, and a few other groups have kind of already touched on this, but basically R0 helps with people, how many of a host can infect other people. So in terms of, it's basically the net reproductive ratio, and it is defined as kind of this reproductive rate for a finite period of time of the pathogen in the host population when hosts are not limiting. And this will help you to determine kind of the number of secondary cases by a primary case. And one thing to note, this is important early on in kind of classifying how the virus will affect the population. And if R0 is less than 1, then eventually the disease will die out. And if R0 is greater than 1, then this means that the infection will continue to spread because you had one previous case, and this is exponentially going to be increasing as is it in contact with more people. So this is a little bit from early on, and has since kind of increased, but the R0 value for COVID right now is was about 3.88 at the time of this graph, and has now kind of increased to about 5.7. And so this is clearly just indicates that it's, exponentially increasing, and it's reaching a mass percentage of our population. It's not going to just die out. And this number is kind of just to show when the lockdown first established, or when we first went into lockdown around, it kind of decreased R0, so it was going closer to 1, which is a good thing. And eventually want to see R0 go below 1, obviously, in order to help with the disease to die out. And again, we can't necessarily say that this specific time zone matches up, or this R0 decline is because of the lockdown, but we can see that there is somewhat of a correlation between this time period. And so then this potentially would be a predicted graph if we had continued, if we can trace all the potential people that are infected, how R0 could potentially drop if we were able to really isolate these cases. So this is just a comparison of other R0 values to see how the pandemic has been in relation to others. So common flu had an R0 about 10, and then SARS has 2 to 4, the Spanish flu, which is like 1.8, and then COVID is like 2.5 to 5.5. But again, these are kind of ranges, and then as herd immunity kind of increases with vaccination, then you see R0 kind of level out a little bit, but clearly that's not the case with COVID right now, and hopefully we're looking to move R0 to below 1. So there are some issues with contact tracing, and it's kind of hard because you need to be able to properly trace them, and if they're asymptomatic or silent spreaders, then it's going to be very difficult to identify that as the host or your initial person. And so this is an issue with like using the R0 solely as a variable to determine like what type of severity of the virus and how much it's going to spread. And also R0 depends on how often people come into contact with one another, and so that can differ drastically between countries, cities, or regions, and so this can also change your R0 value. So it's important not to just use this to kind of estimate or understand how rapidly the pandemic or epidemic is kind of spreading. But it's important to use other reliable factors, and also contact tracing is extremely difficult, and Mila will get more into that in the next few slides.
Yeah, so in this section, we're just going to cover the fundamentals of contact tracing, why we need to use it in order to help stop the spread of COVID-19. Okay, so in this visual, we can see how the spread of COVID-19 can be curbed through contact tracing. So if someone finds out that they're infected and immediately begins self-isolating, that obviously is going to help the spread of COVID more than would happen if they're going out into public spaces and interacting with others. But the problem is that a lot of times people didn't realize they had COVID-19 until a few days after they actually contracted it, until they actually start displaying symptoms, which means they were likely interacting with others during the days they were infectious but didn't know it. Which is why it's important that not only the person who gets a confirmed case of COVID self-isolates, but that we use contact tracing to discover who a person's close contacts are and get them to self-isolate as well. And as you can see in the bottom right of this visual, when the chain of transmission can be stopped when we isolate not only the initial carrier, but also their close contacts, compared to in the upper right, where the person is still going out and their close contacts are going out and infecting others and causing the disease to continue to spread. So contact tracing allows us to know where exposures happen and give us the information to shut down the necessary places that we need to. So this gives us the information, knowing where exposures happen, to shut down industries in a targeted fashion, and to be very proactive in stopping the disease by identifying carriers before they display symptoms and stopping them from going out into the public. So this is a definition of contact tracing that we thought captured it pretty well. It's to reach every person who has tested positive for COVID-19 and their contacts and connect them to the testing, providers, and supports as needed. So we're going to break down this quote a little bit. Okay, so first of all, we're going to look at the contacts section. Or the testing positive, excuse me, sorry. So first we need to look at how we're identifying positive testing. Additionally, how we're reaching out to the people that are testing positive, and what the estimated rate of success for this method is, and if it's actually going to be effective. And if this for some reason isn't working, the method that we're using, we should have a backup option that we can fall back on. Okay, and then looking at the contacts, it's important to look at how contacts are actually defined and what the follow-up procedure is for those contacts. So when looking at Williams College, our system for determining contacts is pretty flawed, and it's difficult for us to trace all the contacts. So in previous cases when people have tested positive, it's mainly just been the people who are in someone's pod or people who were on a bus together. And after someone tests positive, they get a phone call from the college, typically 24 to 36 hours after their positive test, which means they've had at least a day in which they were interacting with others and spreading the disease, and likely even more time than that, which, and contacts are also defined as anyone who's interacted with an individual who tested positive for more than 15 minutes without a mask on, which isn't comprehensive enough and doesn't capture all the potential new carriers. And luckily, we haven't had a ton of COVID cases here at Williams so far, so this hasn't been a huge problem, but it could become a bigger problem in the future if we get more COVID cases. And then the last part of contact tracing is connecting people to the testing and support systems that they need. So it's important to look at what we mean by connection and whether we're simply just, are we providing people a list of providers and supports that's then their job to go access them, or are we making these really easy for people to have access to by providing free testing and quarantining services? Because those are very different, and the people that can access them, that's going to vary greatly based on that. It's important to look at like how affordable and decentralized these testing services are available, especially when looking maybe in rural areas where there might not be huge healthcare services provided, or for people who don't have enough money to like go out and get their own COVID test. And also looking at Williams College, there was a Record article that discussed the sort of this part of the quote about the people once they were in this like quarantining and the different like support systems that they were provided. And it found that students who were forced to quarantine in Dodd housing due to either testing positive for COVID or due to being a close contact of someone who tested positive, found that there was a lack of communication by the college, which was really frustrating for a lot of these students because they really didn't know how long they were going to be quarantining for. They weren't told that. They weren't told what to bring when quarantining. And once in quarantine, they weren't checked in with like different staff. They were basically entirely on their own. So Williams College really needs to improve the assistance that we're providing to people once they're in this quarantining and provide this better connection in order to make this more effective. And this is just a visual that shows how contact tracing can effectively be used to find the links between different cases and discover where and who people contracted COVID from in order to curb the spread of the disease.
So now that we've looked into why and the questions regarding contact tracing and what would make for effective contact tracing, let us now go into the two main modes of contact tracing. So first off, we have our manual contact tracing. So as shown here, this is a visual taken from the Massachusetts Contact Tracing Collective, and it provides a very good representation of how manual contact tracing is done. When someone tests COVID positive, there will be a case investigator. This case investigator will be assigned to contact this new patient to complete a case form and collect information of contacts. And once this information is obtained, a contact tracer will reach out to each and every contact and provide the information and advise the contact that they might need to get tested if they're symptomatic, or they should look into self-isolating or quarantine. And ideally, the goal that Massachusetts has laid out is to reach all contacts within 24 hours to limit further spread. And these contact tracers will also follow up on all of these contacts for the next 14 days to just check up on whether they have symptoms or fever, and from the last contact with an infected person. Next slide. And this is, again, just to reiterate what I mentioned. An interesting thing to note here is that Massachusetts is unique in the sense that Massachusetts has an additional role called the Care Resource Coordinator in the right of the graphic. And what the Care Resource Coordinator does is really to figure out what a patient or someone who's asked to isolate would need to help them complete the isolation successfully. So this could be things like maybe access to food, for example, where they can connect people to other organizations who might be able to deliver food to them if necessary. This might be things like providing a household with more cleaning supplies if someone in their household tests positive, so that they can ensure that common areas are clean and hopefully limit the spread even within the house itself. So moving on, we take a look into who is a close contact. So this is the definition provided by the CDC. And it says that a close contact is someone who's within 6 feet of an infected person for at least 15 minutes, starting from 48 hours before illness onset until the time the person is isolated. Now, this is a pretty interesting working definition for close contact, but already looking at it, I have some suspicions. For example, when they mentioned that 15 minutes starting from 48 hours before illness onset, it is very hard to determine when illness onset is, especially in cases where someone might be asymptomatic. We have no idea, without being able to link them to a particular case, we have no idea how far or how long in the past that they might have already had COVID and who these people might be as well. And in this slide, we're just providing you some statistics. It takes about 90 minutes per initial contact call. Again, as I mentioned, daily follow-up check should occur for 14 days. And Massachusetts estimates that usually for a person, in a case where there's no stay-at-home order, they might have to reach about 10 daily contacts per case, or less than 5 if there's sort of a stay-at-home mandate. And this really plays a huge difference in how how much it taxes the contact tracing infrastructure that's put into place. So in this slide, there is a sort of contact tracing estimator in the bottom right. So when you have the slides, please feel free to play around with it. And what it does, it sort of helps us estimate on the national level how many contact traces are needed. So I've plugged in a few numbers taken from the past. It estimates that at about 40K daily cases, we need about 290,000 traces. At about 60,000 daily cases, we need about 400,000 traces to really reach everyone. And comparing the first and the third number, if there were stay-at-home orders, this decrease in the number of contacts actually leads to a really huge decrease in the number of traces required to be able to reach out everyone successfully. And just take a note that these numbers are taken with like 40,000, 60,000 daily cases, and the current caseload is averaging somewhere about 150,000 or so maybe. And I would like everyone to maybe just take 30 seconds right now to just think and maybe comment in the chat. How many contact traces do you think there are right now in the United States? All right, so the answer in the next slide. So there are only about 53,166 contact traces. This is as of October 14th. The number might have increased slightly in the meantime, but this is not even enough to be able to meet the levels needed, even when we had 40,000 to 60,000 cases. So next slide, please. Most states actually do not have enough contact traces to be able to reach everyone, and this would severely limit the effectiveness of contact tracing and how well it is able to help contain the virus at all. So you can see orange over here represents states that do not meet the estimated need, and only 3 states have shown that they are able to meet the current need right now. So there are also issues with contact tracing. So for example, I mentioned in the earlier slide that Massachusetts has a goal to be able to reach new cases within 24 hours. And in the early days within New Jersey, they witnessed only about 44% of new cases were reached within 24 hours. And this might be because they didn't pick up the phone, they didn't understand what the procedure was, but this is a really small amount and would really impede how effective contact tracing is. And what's worse, within these new cases reach, next slide please. 1 in 2 people who are infected refuse to provide context. This might be because they want to maintain their privacy. This might be because there was an earlier story reported that some people actually went to places like strip clubs and were ashamed to tell the contact tracer about all this. And this really, this again compounds onto the problem that the contact tracers are not working with enough information. They are not able to effectively perform their jobs. And in the next slide, we see that only 22 states provide any information about their contact tracing efforts. We've linked a Google Docs. This is one of the universities is sort of collating all this information about which states are releasing what kind of information, about what statistics they are, how successful are they in reaching the contacts within the first 24 hours, and so on and so forth. And I do recommend people to sort of take a look at this and figure out like how well their states are doing on all these metrics.
Awesome. So as Garrett was kind of saying, there's a huge issue in terms of being able to properly do contact tracing for a lot of states. And in the US and worldwide, we're experiencing issues with this. So one way to kind of combat this is using these applications or with technology. This kind of helps with being able to reach a larger proportion of the population, and also like hopefully to mitigating some of this, if people don't feel as comfortable talking or stating that to someone, hopefully maybe they might feel more comfortable just, putting it on an app. It's a little bit less personal in terms of having that like interaction. So there's a lot of app-based contact tracing nowadays, and a lot of countries are starting to develop their own forms of technology. So I'll get into some of the apps that are out now, but basically it's kind of this, you have this app on your device, on your mobile device, and it tracks either your location, or it'll give you, it has like a code that it'll generate for you. And then when you're diagnosed with COVID, the app, then you'll basically alert the app, or, you know, if you're going to a medical provider and that's connected to the app, then the application will let you know, and then you'll get a notification. This is kind of like what we're using. So like co-verified, not necessarily that we can contact who, or our contacts will be informed, but it's more so we'll be notified once we actually get a positive result directly on our mobile devices. And so it's pretty unique that Apple and Google, two major tech companies, have kind of come together to make this application. And we'll get in a little bit more about what their plans are with this. But basically, you have a key code on your app, and it uses Bluetooth. So if you're within, like, let's say 6 feet of somebody, and it'll rotate, or it'll exchange your key code with everybody that has this app in the vicinity. And then let's say if I were to test positive, I would, if I wanted to, this is again up to me, I would update my status, and then I would give consent to share this database with my database, and then everybody that had rotated or had exchanged my key code would also get notified. This again makes it a lot easier, so you don't have to have contact tracers, and it kind of eliminates or helps to kind of mitigate the amount of positive cases with the amount of tracers that are needed. So this is just a short video about this.
See, again, I wish we could go faster.
David, you recently announced with Apple, I believe, an initiative around contact tracing and that sort of thing. Would you mind sharing with us what you all are doing on this dimension?
Yeah, I'm really proud because we think that the solution here is going to be one, a partnership. So happy to partner with Apple. But what we heard were governments and researchers saying to us, we think contract tracing will be incredibly helpful in getting people back to work, back to life, okay? So taking that problem, we thought we could help collaboratively with Apple. We launched what will be, I think, next week, and then ultimately not even an app, but just on the phone, an ability for public health officials to create apps such that if they want to use contact tracing and individuals have volunteered to be in it, we've put the Bluetooth technology together such that with those permissions, you and I, if we're within 6 feet of each other for more than 15 minutes, and then over the next 2 weeks, you count all the people I've come in contact with. If any of them become positive, I'll get notified, not of the individual, but I'll get notified that I've been in contact with somebody who's now positive. So that's the technology we put together. We wouldn't have done this if we couldn't put that kind of privacy first and security central to design. And that's why it's opt-in, and why we're saying, people can look at the technology, et cetera. But really what we're trying to do is create a digital way to do contact tracing so public health officials that are stretched have this at their fingertips. We think it's only a piece of the solution, right? I think testing is important. That's why we launched all the locations where testing is. It's going to be key to figure out, do these antibodies work? Are they protective, et cetera? The same with the medication. So not that this is a silver bullet, but a foundation to allow public health folks to think more digitally about contact tracing.
Okay, so that was just kind of a quick video to talk about this. And again, this is not the end all be all, obviously, because as Milo was talking about earlier, once you are notified, you also need to have access to testing. And we're very fortunate to be at Williams College and have that resource available to us if we are tested, or if someone in our vicinity was tested and we are considered someone that was within contact with that person. But again, this app is really trying to get at what Garrett was talking about, that we do not have enough contact tracers. We're stretched very thin, and we need some other form to try and close this gap to be able to properly notify everybody that's in contact with somebody that tested positive. So there's 4 major ones that we kind of looked at, 4 major apps that we looked at for contact tracing. So there's the MIT Safe Paths one, there's Google and Apple's, which we just saw a little video on, there's a Corona Warning app, and then there's the Trace Together. And as we have seen, it's kind of each location or region or area has kind of tried to develop their own form of technology. Obviously, it's a business, and some tech companies are trying to kind of like win the race and have this app that's going to be the end all be all in terms of like most successful or most commonly used. So they all kind of use different forms of data collection in order to alert people. So MIT's SafePass uses your location. So basically, it stores your location on your device for however long, for like the day. So it'll record your location of everywhere that you've gone and the duration that you went there and then it'll basically hold that or save that into your phone. And then once you it'll log into this app of all the other people that are using it, and it'll tell you if somebody else was positive and was in the same like locations as you on the GPS. It'll be able to determine where, if you overlap with them and if you were in that vicinity for 15 minutes or longer, and then it'll notify you. Again, the city officials will notify you, not necessarily that the infected patient has the ability to do this. The cost is kind of unknown. For Google and Apple, it's more of like this key code system. So if I had a key code of, let's say 1, 2, 3, 4, and everybody has their own, but let's say another person B has it of 3, 3, 3, 3. And basically, if I 1, 2, 3, 4, I'm in vicinity of someone 3, 3, 3, 3, it'll exchange and it'll save that on my phone, and my 1, 2, 3, 4 will be saved on their application. And if I do test positive, then I will notify my app if I want to, and then the app will notify others that you've been in contact with somebody for 15 or so or more minutes, and that we recommend you get tested. Again, the cost is unknown. And then the one that Germany currently is using, the Corona Warn app, again, kind of uses this key code feature, and it's up to the patient to kind of notify others. Currently, there's about, I want to say, I was reading recently, there was a huge uptick, so like 23% of the German population had downloaded this app. But again, an issue with this is that that's not enough of the population to really kind of get at have this world, in order to notify all the possible people. And again, of that 22% that downloaded the app, not all of them are using it, and not all of them have their, Bluetooth on at the same time. And even of those people that do test positive and use it, and it's up to them to notify others. So as Garrett said, it's about a 1 in 2 of someone that tests positive from when they alert others, which is a huge issue with this. And then the Trace Together in Singapore uses key codes as well. And this you'll be notified by kind of the Ministry of Health. And this is estimated to cost about $1.8 million. So again, these apps are going to cost a lot of money to kind of push out worldwide, which is another issue in and of itself. But these apps are kind of reliant on the fact that everybody has access to a mobile device, and clearly that's not the case. Not everybody has access to a mobile device. That is a luxury, and again, you have to have Bluetooth. For some of these require Bluetooth, and not everybody has Bluetooth on. And then with GPS or the location tracking system, not everybody has their location tracking system on as well. And so this goes into another issue. All of these apps require high adoption in order to be effective, and they use a lot of your battery. So there's a lot of issues that go into kind of in development of these apps. But in combination with contact tracers, this could be helpful, and hopefully moving forward, we'll be able to get kind of high adoption or some other system that will be able to kind of notify you electronically or without the use of having these like specific individuals that are specialized in contact tracing. And yeah, I don't know if Mila, if you want to.
Yeah, so the effectiveness of app-based contact tracing depends on a lot of different variables, some of which Gabby have touched on already. So the major one is going to be adoption and how many people are actually going to be using that app. So we see that the effectiveness of an application scales with the square of the number of adopters. So it's really contingent on getting a large proportion of the population to actually be using that app and be using it effectively. And Oxford did a study and they estimated that 60% of people are going to have to adopt an app in order for actual safe reopening. So that's sort of the threshold that we should try to achieve to effectively be able to reopen our economy and reopen the different places that we want to go to and feel safe doing that while using the app. So one barrier to adoption is that parts of the population don't have smartphones or don't know how to use apps, especially maybe older people who aren't super familiar with technology. And currently the US only has 90% smartphone adoption, which means that we're going to have to get that 60% with not even 100% of the population having smartphones. We're going to have to be going from this even smaller percentage of the population, 90% who have smartphones, making it even more difficult. So one area that is doing something like this is Singapore, who issued these contact tracing tokens, which is a really interesting idea and actually somewhat solves for the smartphone issue because they're giving them to everyone and it's not contingent on you having a smartphone. It's not connected to that in any way. So they're essentially a hardware version of the app that they released earlier in the year. And this app uses Bluetooth to find the devices of other people and track the interactions with others. And Singapore's goal is to eventually distribute all of these tokens to everyone in their country, even foreign individuals who are residing within the nation. But one barrier of this is definitely the cost of buying enough of these that actually will be effective at tracking the spread of COVID. Like Gabby talked about, there need to be an adoption rate of 60% for the device like this to actually be effective. So you need to get a lot of these different devices. And though it would be expensive to buy this quantity of devices, it's also important to look at how in the long run, this might economically benefit the US because it would help stop COVID sooner, resulting in less lockdowns and shutdowns, which are really what is detrimenting the economy. So it might be a short-term cost for long-term gain. Next slide. Yeah. Okay, so also it's important to have proper usage. So we sort of talked about how even if mandated, users might not use this properly. Like the Bluetooth example, you're gonna have to have everyone turning on their Bluetooth to have the app actually be effective. And if there's this provision, such as like the Google app that they're discussing, where people have the autonomy to decide whether their contacts are like informed that they tested positive, a lot of people might not warn their contacts. Like we saw that in Germany, 50% of people didn't warn the contacts that they were infected. But when looking at the Singapore example of these contact tracing tokens, they're actually requiring individuals to have these on their person when going into some high risk areas, which is an interesting idea that could possibly be implemented in the US to make so these are like actually used effectively. But another thing to consider when looking at this is also how, Singapore citizens are okay with the government like being a bit more involved in their life than in the US, where we really value like individuality. So many citizens would probably have privacy concerns with this, see it as the government overstepping and intruding too much into their daily life. So it might be difficult for the US to actually implement something like that where we make it mandatory, which makes it a bit more difficult to actually have this effective app-based contact tracing. And then the final step is, and sort of problem, is the follow-up. So we have to make sure that these apps are effective at giving instructions with regards to quarantining and what that process should look like. And also whether it's just going to be the app giving you the instructions, or if there's going to be actual follow-up, possibly by an actual human who's like contacting you and seeing how it's going. And also another important thing is this access to testing. And if there are economic barriers to testing, it's going to make it a lot more difficult to have effective contact tracing and to have people effectively be able to stop the spread of COVID, just because they're not going to be able to afford the high cost of tests.
And then just to kind of touch on this, so it's kind of like whether or not a country wants to really invest in developing these apps and kind of working with these tech companies to put this out in terms of contact tracing. And then, or also like you're balancing that with vaccines and how much do you want to spend on that as well. And it's kind of like, do you want a combination of, you know, you're spending 50, you're allocating 50% of your funds for a vaccine, or you're going to allocate 50% for this contact tracing. The one benefit for this is that this app can be used for other, if something like this were to happen in the future, then you could potentially continue using this app. Let's say if there's a flu outbreak or, you know, something even within here at a school or somewhere and everyone has the app, you could use this just to do contact tracing in terms of that way. So this has long foreseeable impacts that it could have and it's very versatile.
So now that we've taken a look at the two main modes of contact tracing, we've explored what contact tracing is, we'd just like to present to you some of our additional thoughts and to maybe sum up the whole topic as well. So first, to start of a wild idea. So I mean, we are thankful that the two vaccine candidates have been seemingly pretty effective. But if we are looking in the future, if there might be a pandemic where we might not have vaccines out as quickly, or the vaccines might not be as effective, could there be a possibility for an international digital contact tracing kind of thing? So there's been a collective of people who have proposed a Blue Trace protocol, which similarly uses Bluetooth technology to trace, and it's privacy preserving. So, so thinking about that, like what might be the challenges in determining an international standard for digital contact tracing? Where might the data be stored? What kind of politics might be in play? And yeah. So as Gabby and Myla have repeatedly mentioned, contact tracing is not a holy grail. It has to be paired with sound, effective policy. There's no point in telling people that, okay, you might have been exposed, we need you to isolate, but not be able to provide enough support in terms of money or food or other areas to encourage people to isolate. And contact tracing is really just one of the spectrum of effective measures. Nothing can really hold its own by itself. And it's only when all of them come together that we can decrease the R0 value. One final food for thought, I guess, is sort of governmental assurance. So with contact tracing, the governments or whoever's doing the contact tracing, it might be the companies who are releasing the apps as well. We believe that the contact tracing information should not be misused, and governments should consider enacting laws to assert that all this data that has been collected will be discarded after the pandemic. So to give you an example, in South Korea, earlier in the year, some of the contact tracers actually given things like credit card information. I mean, this is anonymized and everything, but they use it to, for example, say, okay, when they're talking to a patient, they'll be like, okay, do you know where you might have been or who you might be in contact with? Or it says here that you have bought a movie, who do you go to the movie with, and to get information like context and everything as well. So we think that it might be a good step for the government to step up and say, okay, we're going to enact a law. Things we're collecting will not be used against you in the future and will be discarded when the pandemic is over. So just to give greater assurance to all citizens. Now we have some discussion questions for you, food for thought. So how we'll do this is I would sort of go through a few discussion questions to maybe spark your thoughts, and anytime in the chat or whenever, please feel free to just jump in, ask your question, and yeah, we can take it from there. So the first question we have is, how do we balance privacy and effectiveness? So should this be a coordinated effort as a country, or should different states be allowed to decide their balances? In the medical ethics talk the other day, there was a very interesting point that was raised. It was like states, countries, nations should try to deal with this pandemic in sort of a culturally competent fashion. And this sort of balance between privacy and effectiveness might be different depending on whether the country might be more individualistic or collectivist, and finding this appropriate balance. And with the United States being having sort of a national level as well as the state level, like how much do we think we should balance this out with everyone? So the next question, should providing false information be considered an offense? So if someone were to ask you like, oh, have you been to this area, this particular shopping mall, for example, and maybe the person decides to say no, should this be considered offense because it might be an act of knowingly endangering other people and not providing health officials the information required to stop the spread? And the last question that we had.
Oh, I'm just gonna add to this question.
Sure.
So in terms of like, this is again also kind of difficult to identify because some people, let's say you kind of forget if someone is asking. I know at Williams they call you and they ask if you test positive. They just ask you, who have you been in contact with within 6 feet for 15 or more minutes. And although this could be, you could have a mask on. And so it could be difficult. Let's say you're, in Pereski or like in the line. Technically, you're all 6 feet away, but it can be difficult to try and pinpoint in the last like 3 to 4 days, who you've been in contact with. And so then this kind of gets on this, if you provide false information, is that difficult to kind of, it's not necessarily offense, but you may not necessarily have known that you were in contact with that person.
So the last discussion question we had is sort of what information should contact tracers have access to? And yeah, so as previously mentioned, in South Korea, they have access to credit card details and other factors. And what is the balance that we are able to let our contact tracers say, okay, you can have this much information and so on. So I'd like to open up the floor to anyone, Professor Miller, or anyone within the Zoom or lecture discussions. If you have any questions, we're happy to take.
So one possibility is we can quickly ask the class. I created a Google Sheet. Would you be willing to do contact tracing on your phone? Would you be willing to take a vaccine? So if people are interested, I will put the link in the chat right now. And so there are two categories. There are students and there are alums. I could put a third category of professors, but then there would be some issue with the data as my response would be uniquely identifiable. You want to just take a minute and just go there and say, would you be willing to do this voluntarily? And interesting, the second question might be, would you do this if it was mandatory? But in the interest of time, I will not ask that. So one of the questions, of course, in terms of would you do this? A lot of it could depend, and maybe I should put an unsure. So I'll put unsure, because maybe the answer depends on what is done, just who gets the information. So hopefully people can get to the web page, and then just below the yeses, the nos, write what you would be willing to do. If you're a yes, put a 1 by the yes. So just go below these numbers. Are people able to enter? Or this might not be good in real time with people. Yeah, this is probably not good in real time. Probably should have done as a survey. But even some partial data could be interesting. So I'll move things down. I like this idea of people, writing numbers going below. I like that idea. So I'll move the alums all the way down. All right, this does not seem to be working that well. Okay, now there'll still be some information. But with a little data, we're already seeing yeses and nos. And then when you were doing your research in the different countries, how much did they talk at all about people's concerns about the data and what's done with it, and what else might be done with that in the future?
Sorry, could you repeat your question?
Sure. When you were doing your research about what other countries are doing with contact tracing, with the devices, was there talk about concern about what else might be done with this data?
Sure. So I can chime in a bit with my experience, just talking to people. And I think, so just for context, I'm Singaporean, so I'm more familiar with the whole Trace Together ecosystem and everything. And I would say that one concern that people might have might be, I think it boils down to a certain suspicion of the government. And especially things like, if you have an app, it's a lot harder to say what goes on in the background of the app. Is the government maybe being a big brother and secretly tracking and recording all your observations and sending it and analyzing it and so on and so forth. So there's this sort of fear of the unknown and what might lead to. There's some concerns about possibly a slippery slope of sorts, in the sense that, okay, I've seen people post things like, okay, so right now they have access to contact tracing data, and then maybe the next step they might ask you to say, okay, why don't you just keep this on a little bit after the pandemic, and maybe we can use this data to determine who, maybe you were out in the streets and maybe you happen to witness a knife fight, for example. Will you allow this people to use this data to maybe trace out who this knife, who the assaulter is, and so on and so forth?
Right, and the argument will always be made that this is for a good cause, that this data will be used, and it will be used to do a lot of good. The question is balancing what else it can be used for. Right,
so which is why I added a point in my further thoughts to sort of talk about having a governmental assurance to maybe enact laws to say that, this data won't be used for other things. I think with respect to application-based tracing, there might be more open source coding. There might be people who can reverse engineer the app to show that, okay, it does nothing malicious. What the Singapore government did when they released the token was to invite privacy experts to basically do a tear down of the token and basically look into it and say, okay, there's no GPS in it, so you can't track your location for certain because the hardware is just not there. But yeah.
Does anybody else have any other comments?
I could bring up my token if you're interested in looking at it.
So just quickly looking at the quick responses, the unscientific responses from the question, would you voluntarily do contact tracing? I see 5 yeses for students, 2 nos, and 5 unsure. Would you voluntarily take a vaccine when it comes out? 7 yeses, 2 nos, 3 unsures. For the alums, very different. All the alums, 2 would do contact tracing, and the 2 would also take the vaccine when it comes out. Now, I was actually talking with a student from my Math 150 class this morning. We met for coffee, and I don't know if I would have my kids take the vaccine immediately because they are both under 15, and when you look at their age group, the risk is very low, and if there's a choice and we don't know about side effects, so it's going to be very interesting to see how that changes based on demographics. Thank you very much for the presentation.